So what is the last problem that Nagel has to deal with in this essay, defending the idea that death is an evil, that at least most of the time when death occurs, something bad has happened to someone. The other major problem that he's dealing with here is the Lucretian asymmetry problem. This is the second sense of second asymmetry that we're dealing with here. Lucretius says that before we are born, we do not exist. That's prenatal non-existence. After we die, we do not exist. That's posthumous non-existence. In both cases, we have non-existence, and non-existence is non-existence. So for a long time before we were born, we didn't exist. And for a long time after we die, we don't exist. So why is it that we regard the former, prenatal non-existence, as not something bad, and we regard the latter, posthumous non-existence, as an evil? Lucretius's point, as I take it from reading Nagel at least, is that that's irrational, and we should regard neither as a misfortune. So how does Nagel argue against this? Let's see. Top of page 79, actually bottom of 78, he, meaning Lucretius, observed that no one finds it disturbing to contemplate the eternity preceding his own birth. And he took this to show that it must be irrational to fear death, since death is simply the mirror image of the prior abyss. That is not true, however, says Nagel. And the difference between the two explains why it is reasonable to regard them differently. It is true that both the time before a man's birth and the time after his death are times when he does not exist. But the time after his death is time of which his death deprives him. The key point here for Nagel is that, yes, we do not exist before birth, but that non-existence does not entail any deprivation. We have not been deprived of any of the goods of life. Whereas when we die, we have been deprived. So if that's true, it would justify the asymmetrical treatment of prenatal and posthumous non-existence. Prenatal non-existence does not entail any deprivation. Nothing bad has happened to you because nothing good has been taken away. Whereas if when you die, something good has been taken away. There is the possibility of more goods, and death has deprived us of those goods. Now, not everybody agrees with Nagel on this point. That is, because what Nagel is saying is that it's really logically impossible to have been born much earlier than you were born. He says, you could, okay, your mother could have gone into labor a day or two earlier, and that's, your non-existence would have, well, we exist as embryos, so that doesn't even make any sense, come to think of it. But what Nagel's point is that if you had been born a lot earlier than you were, you wouldn't be the same person, you'd be a different person. So it makes no sense to say, all the time I didn't exist before I was born, I was being deprived of goods that I could have otherwise experienced. If you had been born any substantial time earlier than you were, you would be a different person. You wouldn't be you, so you really couldn't say that you were deprived of anything. Whereas, if I die right now, it makes perfect sense to say that I would thereby be deprived of goods that I otherwise would have experienced. So the second asymmetry, the asymmetry between posthumous and prenatal non-existence, Nagel says it's okay to treat them asymmetry because they're very different things. We're not deprived of anything because we have not yet been born. But when we die, we're deprived of the goods that we otherwise would have experienced. But even, Nagel says, well, but how far can we take this? I mean, if somebody lives to be 112 and then they die, have they really been deprived of anything? Let's see, what page is it on? Bottom of page 79, he says, we are left, therefore, with the question whether the non-realization of this possibility, the possibility of more life, is in every case a misfortune, or whether it depends on what can naturally be hoped for. This seems to me the most serious difficulty with the view that death is always an evil. I mean, is it always a bad thing to die? And let's not say that you're in great pain or suffering and you're begging for death. No. Is it always a bad thing for a human being to die? A 90-year-old human being is living a perfectly happy life and then dies peacefully. Did something bad happen to them? It's not really clear. A 20-year-old person who's living a peaceful and life and looking, or not so peaceful, but just looking forward to more life, if they die suddenly, then we definitely say something bad has happened to them, under the Nagel hypothesis at least, because they've been deprived of decades of healthy, vigorous, active life. But Nagel says that the fact that it is worse to die, this is on page 80, at 24 than at 82, that is, he admits that it's worse to die young than to die old. The fact that it is worse to die at 24 than at 82 does not imply that it is not a terrible thing to die at 82, or even at 806. Now, from the outside, that may, as he says, and it just may be ridiculous to say such a thing. He says in the last paragraph, observed from without, human beings obviously have a natural lifespan and cannot live much longer than 100 years. Let's say if we view ourselves objectively, it may be silly to feel there's any injustice in not living beyond 82, being deprived of, further life. But he makes an interesting point right after that. He says, a man's sense of his own experience, that is, a person's sense of their own experience, on the other hand, does not embody this idea of a natural limit. His existence defines for him an essentially open-ended possible future, so that it may be that viewed as a natural creature, as an animal, as a human being, as that type of being, that it's silly to think that I have much left after 82 or 92, whatever. But we don't live that way. We live a life of open-ended possibility no matter how biologically old or young we are. So that Nagel is saying that open-endedness, those possible trajectories, those possible futures are always, no matter how old we are, in some sense diminished by death. That is, we are always deprived of some good by death whenever it happens in our lifespan. So that death is always an evil. So here we get another view of it, the anti-Epicurean view of it. And I think the key point in Nagel, and the key point is overcoming the Epicurus point that when death comes, we are not, and when we are, death has not yet come. That, Nagel says, is a misunderstanding of, that indeed may be true, but to conclude from that death cannot be an evil or is not a bad thing, is a misunderstanding of how we assign misfortune or bad things to persons. Nagel's key point is that a person does not have to be aware of a misfortune in order for it to be a misfortune for them. The person does not have to experience pain or suffering in order to experience a misfortune. And the strongest point here, I think, and what I'd like to maybe pick up in the discussion, is this point about the person who's received a brain injury and has been mentally diminished but doesn't know it. We would certainly say that something bad, something evil had happened to them. And that seems to open up the space where we could say that something evil, something bad has happened to a person who's died.